Hello, everyone. Today we're doing the next lecture in our series for free universities for free scientific education. Today we have Professor Kevin Anderson as our guest. For those of you who don't know Professor Anderson he is a Marxist professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a sociologist and Marxist humanist. He's the author of the books such as Marx at the Margins, Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism. He's been awarded an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, the International Erich Fromm Prize, a National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Research Grant, the Latifa Yurshater Award for the Best Book in Iranian Women's Studies, and the Paul Sweezy Book Award from the Marxist Select Section of the American Sociological Association. Professor, welcome. Welcome to our program. We wanted to begin with the next question. The death of George Floyd has been a world high agenda for almost 2 weeks now. Mass protests have been carried out in America. And what is the situation in America right now? Are the protests still going on? And could you please inform the viewer about the current situation and political content of the protests?
Thank you. Glad to be here. The protests are still going quite strong. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets Sunday and then Saturday this weekend. So there's no sign yet of it dissipating. What has dissipated a little bit is some of the attacks on property. We haven't seen as much of that in the past 3 or 4 days, but a lot of that is because the police pulled back a little bit, and also because finally a week ago, all the police officers were formally indicted, whereas in the first week of protests, only one of the police officers had been indicted. So this is a very large, very militant, and sustained social movement of a type we haven't really seen in this country since the early 1970s. I'm one of the few people participating in it that's old enough to remember a time when it was this large and this sustained. Because it's not like there's, one day of demonstrations around the city and then everyone goes home. This has been going on every day. It's very much of a grassroots, spontaneous kind of organization. A lot of it is organized just on Facebook and so forth. A lot of the demands are directed at the police specifically to either radically change or, in one case of the city of Minneapolis, even possibly abolish the police force. It's also, so it has to be seen in light of like decades of protests against police brutality. If you know the history of the black rebellions of the 60s, the ones that were sometimes called riots, although I don't like to use that term. The Watts in Los Angeles, 1965, Detroit, 1967, Miami, 1980, and later on Los Angeles, 1992. All these are caused by police brutality toward the black community. Very, very old issue. The Black Panther Party was founded around the issue of defense against police brutality. What's new is the mobilization in north and south as well as north. Even small southern towns are having protests over this, and also the much larger participation of people people outside the black community. Huge numbers of young people of all races and ethnicities. And if it weren't for the COVID-19, where a lot of older people my age, for example, are being warned to stay off the streets because it's particularly dangerous for us in our age group to get COVID-19. I mean, I went to one of the demonstrations, but I haven't as many as I normally would have. So there's a whole population that would probably be out there, and it would make it even larger. So it's quite a remarkable series of events, and as you mentioned, it's having worldwide impact. And of course, the United States is not the only country that has this problem. Black people are not the only people that basis. One thinks of, for example, the Kurdish people in Turkey and a number of the neighboring countries. It's actually very, very similar. Also, the Armenian community, what's left of it, in Turkey. And I know personally a young Armenian guy who's American who's been out there every day in the protests here in Los Angeles.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. So you mentioned about the police brutality and the demand for abolishing the police, or rather, defunding the police. So could you please tell us more about the kinds of discussions about the demands of the protesters? For example, I want to mention some: defunding the police, demolishing the police, and rebuilding whatever instead of it. Could you please tell us more about these kinds of discussions and inform the viewer?
Well, as I'm sure you know, because your group is familiar with the Marxist tradition, this goes all the way back at least to 1871 with the Paris Commune. And as Marx wrote in the Civil War in France, that they abolished both the standing army and the police, and they had the citizens policing themselves. Yeah. So this is a very old demand of the labor movement, of the socialist movement, certainly even more so of the anarchist movement, of course, to get rid of not only the police but the state itself. And of course, the police are the armed expression of the state. But in the United States, that has always had a particular kind of coloration, because in a lot of other countries, the origin of the modern police is to suppress the labor movement. And that's true in the United States also. But the even older origin of the police in the United States is the slave patrol, because in the southern states, especially where there are very large populations of blacks, during slavery times, states like South Carolina had a majority of black people living there. So basically, every white person had police power over black people. And blacks were not allowed to carry weapons, whereas whites were. And this is the actual origin of the police. These informal organizations that were used to catch and discipline slaves eventually become more formalized as the police forces. So this is actually the ugly of policing, and people are talking about this openly right now. Defunding the police is very similar. I mean, the police are one of those areas of the government budget that even in times of austerity, they don't ever lessen. So Los Angeles, I think it's $2 billion a year for the police. And until, of course, he changed his mind by now. But initially, the mayor was saying, well, we're going to cut everything, the school budget, everything, but we're going to keep the police budget. I mean, this is normal logic of capitalism. In fact, the normal logic of capitalism is when you have austerity, you actually have to increase the police budget, right? I mean, I think that's happening a lot of other places too, closer to where you are. So this has been a demand of left-wingers and black activists for decades to abolish the police. But now it's becoming really part of the wide public discourse. And of course, this shocking thing that happened in Minneapolis yesterday, where there's 12 or 13 members of the city council. 9 members showed up at a rally and said we want to abolish the police, not change the budget or lower it, but abolish it. And here in Los Angeles, they're saying defund the police, which sometimes means all the funding, but normally means like maybe taking half the funding away from them and giving it to other sectors of public service, like social work and education, things like that. That's what and there's also a lot of the police have a semi-military structure. They also have a civil service structure, which means no matter how abusive they are, it's impossible for the political authorities to fire them from their jobs. So it's very, very hard. I mean, not only it's just very difficult, and so they have this bureaucratic kind of autonomy, even within the state to a certain degree. Although, of course, ultimately they're the armed representatives of capital, as is the military.
Yes. Thank you for your answer, Professor. So, could you please highlight more some of the slogans that have been used in the protests for the last 2 weeks, and the specific demands that the general public has been protesting about?
Yeah, there have been a number of slogans. I mean, Black Lives Matter, remember George Floyd, and then they've also say out a lot of there's some other names of people killed by the police that have become prominent because there are protest movements around that. I would say the slogans are kind of that sort, quite general, and because of the lockdown due to COVID-19, a lot of the organized left-wing groups are just not out on the street as organizations. You don't see that much of that. And also the movement is so new, so it's really just emerging fairly spontaneously, and it doesn't have any real spokespersons. It's really unclear who is speaking. And we also have to mention the government of President Trump, because they have really exacerbated the situation, even threatening to use military in a brutal way to stop the protest. This backfired on them, and they had to stop talking about that. But they did brutalize some people right near the White House. But it really, really reverberated against the government, the way that they're handling it. You don't see the normal. Normally you'd see like counter protests. We support the police, this kind of thing. I haven't seen it. Now maybe they'll wait and organize themselves in the next couple of weeks, but we haven't really seen very much of that.
Yes. So could we please more talk about the economic situation, economic causes of the protests? So apart from the political side of the story, could you please tell us about the impact of America's economic crisis, unemployment, and poverty on these kinds of protests?
Well, I mean, as in Turkey and India is another one we could mention. On paper, the U.S. economy had been doing fairly well, supposedly, until about 2 months ago when COVID-19 hit.
Yeah.
But if you look deeper, what you find is that, well, the unemployment rate has gone down. I mean, until February. It was in the period of the last few years it had been going down. But the kind of jobs that are being created are not well-paying, secure jobs. There's a certain precariousness. The precariat is actually a good term, and especially for young people. A lot of young people, even with a lot of education coming onto the job market, find themselves just working 2 or 3 jobs. So there's that. George Floyd was actually an example of that. He had 2 jobs, and then he lost one of them as a result of COVID-19. So he was working involuntarily part-time. And of course, since COVID-19 hit, we've had a global economic crisis. And, different people have different theories about that. But my view is that this is actually an economic crisis. It's not simply a result of COVID-19. And that, that there have been kind of a bubble economy again, certainly in many parts of the world, and it was just kind of waiting to fall, and COVID-19 kind of gave it that push. So even places like China are saying they're not going to be able to get back that quickly to the growth rates and the employment rates that they had been at. So, of course, the effects of that in the United States, because this is a racialized capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
For example, in the last month, unemployment went down slightly from the month before, though it's terrible still, but black unemployment got worse. So you have those disparate effects. This became very visible to the population when COVID-19 hit and a lot of workplaces shut down. And of course, black people, Latino people tend to be much more in service and other handwork type jobs. And so they couldn't go to work in some cases. Whereas white collar and professional people like me at the university, I can still do my work from home on the internet. But a lot of people couldn't. And then there was a second part of the people of color, that part of the working class, which is probably close to half of the working class, were forced to go to work. The people who were delivering, the people who were working in grocery stores, the people who were producing the agricultural goods, of course, the healthcare professionals and workers, all those kinds of people collecting the garbage, all those people were forced to go to work. And of course, they're very well aware that they're in great danger while they're doing this. And so the death rates, initially the death rates of COVID-19 were among some of the wealthier parts of the population. But once it really got going, now you can see it much more in the poorer parts of the population, especially the black and the Latino and Native American communities. So people are well aware of this. So this is part of what's fueling the anger against police brutality.
So it's actually really good that you mentioned anger against police brutality. So could you please more elaborate on the level of information that the people that have been protesting have? So do these people are these people content with the types of responses that generally more popularly positive responses that the government gave? For example, changing the 16th road that led to the White House to Black Lives Matter Plaza, if I'm not mistaken. And are people more aware of the political content, the systematic repression against Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans? Are people is there a tendency for this to get more political and more sort of anti-system?
Yeah. Well, of course, you have to also add another factor in, which is the campaign of Bernie Sanders over the past year. This was getting millions of people involved, and this ended only in February, just as COVID-19 really came in. So there's a lot of younger people that were radicalized and got talking about socialism and critique of capitalism during the Sanders campaign. So that's certainly a factor. I mean, it's very interesting that these demonstrations, if you go back to even LA 1990, the demonstrators demonstrated inside the communities of color, and they attacked state institutions and also businesses in those communities. This one, at least in Los Angeles, where I'm more familiar, this one they headed to Beverly Hills and they tried to storm a Gucci department store, and the police chased them, but they were able to destroy another one, and they scrawled signs on the wall about Black Lives Matter, but also Eat the Rich and things like that. Secondly, you mentioned anything these public officials are doing, like painting a Black Lives Matter thing. This, some people are happy. I mean, of course, a lot of people are happy to see this, and the liberal part of the media is celebrating it. What the liberal part of the media, at least when I saw the coverage yesterday, that what they didn't tell was other people painted right next to it defund the police. So they were dissatisfied with the fact of just this abstract call, Black Lives Matter, was because people are saying, if you're a politician and you hold office, we don't want you to say Black Lives Matter. We want you to do something. You have power, so do something. Don't just come and like wave to us and say you love us or something like that. When you get that kind of thing, it's kind of like when the Israelis and the Palestinians, they meet, they have some high school kids and they meet and they play basketball and then they go back. Well, now we get along better. It doesn't solve anything. And so it's a similar kind of thing so we've had a lot of state officials suddenly, becoming supportive, they say, but I think what they're hoping is that the movement dies down. There's one third aspect. It's a very unusual thing, at least, I don't know that many countries where this happens, but the prosecutorial office, like we call them district attorneys, in San Francisco and Philadelphia, left-wingers have now been elected to this office, and a left-of-center person is running in Los Angeles County too, against a black woman who is very pro-police, Jackie Lacey, who's a target. Every week the Black Lives Matter was having protests at her office. So we've had, in New York City, for instance, the district attorney was not that progressive. He said, well, we're not going to prosecute any of these people arrested if it was just for violating the curfew. We're just going to drop the charges. So you have a lot of this kind of thing happening, and I'm not even sure there'll be harsh prosecutions of the people who attack property. I'm not sure of that. There isn't that kind of atmosphere that there usually is of condemnation of that. I mean, there is condemnation, but it isn't strong and emotional in the way it was in previous kinds of situations like this.
So recent research in America suggests that more than 50% of young people in America, specifically the age group of 18 to 29, have a positive look on socialism. So in this context, do you think these protests will be shaped more and more as anti-capitalist, and specifically, do these young people in America have the agenda to pursue this quest of socialism?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there's a lot more anti-capitalist sentiment out there being expressed than socialist sentiment. For example, the leaders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, she regularly says capitalist, she says racism rooted in our capitalist system. This is like a typical thing that a lot of people say. And of course, the Sanders campaign has popularized the word socialism among that group. I mean, I think your figure was actually a little too low in terms of that age group. Because I've seen it all the way up to age 50 having a positive view. But of course, you have to be aware, as I'm sure you are, that Sanders sometimes says what he means by socialism is the policies of Franklin Roosevelt, during the 1930s and 40s. So it's putting the word socialism out there, which has been excluded from the U.S. the mainstream political discourse since World War II, really. But of course, so it's different that way from France or Germany, where there are these social democratic parties. The Democratic Party had some socialist aspects in that sense, social democratic aspects, but they never would use the word socialism, and it would be the other side that would attack them as social. They would say, no, we're not socialist. I mean, typical of that is someone like Elizabeth Warren, who has all those progressive policies, not quite as much so as Sanders, but she says, I'm a capitalist, I'm not a socialist. That's what they used to do. Sanders kind of flipped that a little bit. And of course, it's been like over 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern European regimes. So the word socialist, the connection of socialism with authoritarian regimes, and also the enemy of the United States, is just like not there anymore. There's a young generation that thinks who cares about that? And capitalism, of course, as the slightly social democratic aspects of the U.S. system have receded under neoliberalism, we're getting this really harsh capitalism again, very blatant. It's very blatant about enriching the very rich. I mean, there's not even much talk that that's a problem until recent years. So there's a generation that is very angry about economic inequality, that was gravitating towards Sanders, and among the white youth, much less racist than any previous generation. Racial attitudes continue slowly to improve in the United States, and you shouldn't really take Trump's victory as proof that the United States is. I hope these protests are showing people that the United States is not the population anyway is not uniformly racist. That we elected this far-right racist Donald Trump. It's very split, and he's very unpopular in certain sectors. But it doesn't mean that he won't win, because I don't think he'll win, but I think there's a chance he would. If he can mobilize his voters, and if the other side doesn't inspire the younger people and people of color to come out to the polls. But we have to be aware that, like, Minneapolis is one of the most liberal cities in the United States. It has its second black police chief right now, who claims he's going to reform the police, but they're not able to. Maybe, and to some extent they don't want to, but they're also really not able to, because it's such a large systemic issue, and the police were put in place by the capitalist system, and some sectors of it are getting uncomfortable with the way the police are operating, but they're in place, and it's not going to be so easy to dismantle them or even to defund them, because they have very powerful lobbies. I would compare their lobby to the gun owner. I think everyone's aware that around the world of the craziness of the United States, where we have the National Rifle Association. All these people that our politicians are scared to vote to tell them they can't own machine guns, because it's a lobby that can mobilize a certain sector of the voters and has a lot of money. The police lobby is very similar. Every city has a police union, police associations, and they collect money from businesses, and they oppose candidates for election and support others. And it's very hard to get elected mayor of a city if you don't have the support of the police. So they're a very powerful lobby. And this is a very big movement, but they're not going to go away with that. They're not going to change, even in a mild way, without a big fight and a sustained movement. And ultimately, we know what the purpose of police are under capitalism, which is ultimately not to protect people, but to defend the property and privileges of the ruling classes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor. As the last question, I want to ask you about the role that media played during these protests. For example, we spoke to a young journalist who was shot by I think it was a plastic pepper bullet, and this is just one case of attack on journalism during the protests. But generally, the population has seen immense police brutality in these protests, but we don't get the same attention in the media about all of this. So,
the particularly dramatic and violent examples, if they happen to be filmed, some of them have gotten on television the last 3 or 4 days. We've seen a few of them. There were 2 students who were brutalized by 6 police in Atlanta, Georgia. two black students, and then there was a white man a few years who was pushed by the police in Buffalo, New York, and he's in the hospital now. And he was just looked like he was asking a police officer a question. They just pushed him down onto concrete. So there's a number of these things going on. We have a lot of different kinds of media in the United States. We have the corporate media, some of which are liberal, like MSNBC has covered the protests quite sympathetic. Some of their journalists have actually been brutalized. And then we have, the alternative media like Democracy Now!, Jacobin. If I can, I'll mention imhojournal.org, which I write for, which has had 3 very good articles on first-hand reports on the demonstrations and the whole situation. So we've got a lot of media. And a lot of this, of course, a lot of younger people get their news through Facebook or Twitter or other social media, and don't get it from. So the protests themselves are probably not being driven that much by television, but the general public's attitudes are being formed to a great extent by it. And we have had upheavals even inside some of the most established media organizations. The editorial board editor of the New York Times resigned yesterday. Was forced to resign because he published a far-right, they called them opinion pieces, op-ed pieces, by a Senator, Tom Cotton from Alabama, the title was "Send in the Troops." And there was such upheaval. Hundreds of New York Times journalists didn't report to work and signed petitions, and he was fired, basically. And then another big newspaper, fairly big anyway, in the biggest newspaper in the city of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia, I think it's the main editor had to step down yesterday because he published an editorial saying property has rights too, or protect property, that we should, something like that. That wasn't the exact phrase. Let me see if I can get property matters too. Black lives matter.
Yeah, property matters too. I see the irony in that.
You could check that. So, yeah.
Is there anything you want to add?
Well, I just think if you look at it from a point of view of the subjective forces, the agents of change and revolution, we've had 2 huge movements in the past year. We've had the Sanders campaign, which mobilized hundreds of thousands, a lot of them younger people, a lot of white people, and a lot of Latinos, and a lot of Latino workers supporting. The black community didn't go that strongly for Sanders, though. Some did, but Biden had a lot of support among older black politicians, the old guard, so to speak. And so they were able to, one of the ways Biden was able to win the nomination was through these networks. And there was this sentiment that wasn't expressed publicly, but like, are the blacks still as revolutionary as they were? That was kind of being said by some of the pro-Sanders people. Well, now we have the answer to that. They clearly still are. But it does point to a real division. We have a huge social movement. We've had 2 really huge social movements in the past year, but they're not fully coalescing in the way they need to if we're really going to challenge the system. And this is an old problem in the United States. Going back, I mean, certainly for my generation, we had this gigantic movement against the war in Vietnam, which was mainly white. And then we had this gigantic civil rights movement, which was initially multiracial, but then it became the Black Liberation Movement. And the whites kind of started disregarding it and going into the anti-war movement. So we had these 2 kinds of movements paralleling each other, but not really connecting. And I think that still is a challenge. And it parallels the challenge inside the working class. Can the white workers and the black workers unite? And the way that's going to have to happen is if the white workers deal more with the whole history of racism in this country, including one themselves, just like all white people. have to deal with it.
Yep. So that's about it. That's all. Thank you for your answers and thank you for your time, Professor Anderson. I'm sorry, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to just finish that last thought
Sure.
with the famous quote from Karl Marx, which is right in Capital Volume 1, which is, labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself when in the black skin it's branded, in other words, in chains, in the chains of slavery. So this is a problem
Absolutely.
in societies like the United States, and I think we could connect it to other peoples like the Kurdish question in Turkey, other similar, the so-called immigrant question in places like France. This is really a global phenomenon that is really part of capitalism, and it should be part of any sophisticated, serious class analysis, which sometimes it isn't. So
Which
thank you.
sometimes it is. Absolutely. So, Professor, so we want the viewers to be more engaged with your work and with your articles. So, where can the viewer learn more about you and more about your articles and work? So, could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I have a personal website, kevinanderson.com, and then I have it imhojournal.org. Most of my writings appear there. Of course, I have 3 books that have been translated into Turkish. You mentioned The Marx at the Margins and the Lenin-Hegel book. It's also Foucault and the Iranian Revolution that I co-authored with Janet Afari that came out in Turkish.
Yeah.
I continue to, I'm right now working on a book on the late Marx, his writings on non-European, colonial, and indigenous societies. There are these texts called the Ethnological Notebooks you might be aware of. And my book, Marx at the Margins, talks about this but briefly, but this is a book-length study. I'm also about to publish some of my writings from 30 or 40 years of writings on dialectics is going to come out in a small book. And then I have a book coming out, which I've co-edited with 2 other people, Heather Brown, whose book was published in Turkish on Marx and Gender in the Family, one of my former students, and Kieran Durkin. We're about to come out with an edited collection on my mentor, Raya Dunayevskaya. It's called Raya Dunayevskaya's Intersectional Marxism. That will be out later this year with essays by about a dozen people. So those are some of the projects I'm working on right now. And of course, I've already written a few books, but I'm not stopping. I'm going strong.
And in solidarity with that power, with that effort into the future, I guess. So thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for watching today's lecture. We will air our next lecture next week. So see everyone, and thank you once again, Professor. Hello everyone. Today we're doing the next lecture in our series for free universities for free scientific education. Today we have Professor Kevin Anderson as our guest. For those of you who don't know Professor Anderson he is a Marxist professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a sociologist and Marxist humanist. He's the author of the books such as Marx at the Margins, Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism. He's been awarded an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, the International